That's why clowns are so frightening. Hi, everybody. My name is Mike Seibold. I'm a partner here at FlowerHire. FlowerHire, building a conscious cannabis community one hire at a time. Today, I'm being joined with Hirsh Jain from Ananda Strategy. Hirsh, please tell the people in TV land what you do.
My name's Hirsh Jain. I run a firm called Ananda Strategy that works with many of the leading brands and retailers in the country, helping them open up new dispensaries and also helping brands enter new states and to identify what retail partners they want to partner with.
So, for being in cannabis for as long as you have a pretty strong holistic lens on what's going on. You know, before we actually started filming, you mentioned the idea like you're kind of enamored in love with all the states because they all have new and exciting potential and possibilities. And your expertise, your methods, and your capabilities that you've seen battle test in other markets might make sense for these new markets. In terms of California, let's start with the biggest and baddest and probably the most familiar to you. Issues, opportunities, insights. You had once mentioned, I think it was on Investing in Cannabis, the podcast, that cannabis has come out of a death spiral in California, but now it's not necessarily the whole way home. What is kind of your initial take on where the market is right now?
Yeah, I mean, I think as it's not news to most people that California is probably the most challenged cannabis market in the country. And again, people are probably familiar that it's about a $5 billion legal market, but the illegal market is estimated at least $10 billion. And so it has a really robust illicit market, and that's the problem in California. I think the question then becomes, why is there such a robust illicit market in California? And really there are two simple reasons. One is a lack of retail access. So on a per capita basis, California should have 4,000 dispensaries to serve the legal market. I mean, that would put it on par with Colorado and Oregon, but there's only about 1,100 dispensaries in the state. So there's a lack of retail access, and that contributes to a persistent illicit market. And also, those retailers are overwhelmingly concentrated into a few cities in the state. So there's about 500 cities in California, and not to get too wonky, but 7 of those cities, so 7 out of 500, account for more than 40% of the dispensaries in the state.
There's that kind of concentration?
That kind of concentration. Wow. Yeah, I mean, it's really remarkable. So in those cities, it's increasingly difficult for those retailers to compete in an increasingly crowded market. And then there are huge swaths of the state where it's impossible to purchase cannabis legally. And so, of course, there's a robust illicit market. And we can unpack why that is, but that's sort of the first problem. And then the second problem, again, as is known to folks, is just the tax burden. Yeah. California taxes cannabis more than any other state once you consider both the hidden and the visible taxes. And just to kind of go through them quickly, there's a 15% state excise tax. There's a local excise tax, which can be up to 10%. And unlike other jurisdictions, California doesn't cap where those taxes are. There's a huge sales tax. And then there's a bunch of hidden taxes that are applied earlier in the supply chain that inflate the price of legal cannabis, even if you don't see it when on the receipt when you're paying for it. So at a high level, those are the two issues.
So given the circumstance of what you know about California being malformed and malfunctioning, right? Having taxes which compound on taxes, which compound on taxes, lack of access from a consumer standpoint, just swaths of a massive market in a state like California being not coming to and having unmet need. On the flip side, what has been a showcase and a demonstration of a market that's been more effective, or more importantly, maybe who would you say by virtue of where California is, what is like the opposite end of the continuum? Who is actually doing it right and well?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting and telling to compare the California and the Michigan markets. Oh. The reason I say that is that there's a lot of similarities that the two have, right? Both have had a long-standing cannabis culture and a robust, what we might call gray market, right? Michigan has had its caregiver model. So you have a really robust, sort of illicit gray market for a long time. Michigan also has local control, which is to say, just like California, the state legalized cannabis, but then said, hey, local municipalities, you can decide whether or not you're going to opt in to legal sales. Both have undergone a significant amount of price compression over the past 18 months. And so in many ways, these two states are similar, but that's kind of where the similarities end. And the reason that Michigan has, by some measures, the most successful cannabis market out there, at least as judged by per capita sales, is number one, they have continued to open up new dispensaries across the state. I mean, if you just look at a time series map of the retailers in Michigan over the past 3 to 4 years, you will see just more and more retail access. And in addition, Michigan has a really low tax rate. And so in some ways that illustrates how simple this could be, right? If California followed Michigan's model and similarly had robust retail expansion and had a minimal tax burden, I mean, if it were doing the same per capita sales as Michigan, this would be a $12 billion market. So I point that out because they are dealing with the same set of circumstances, a gray market and all that, but they have charted a slightly different course and are a much more successful market.
Now, do you think that's circumstantial to the underlying business attitudes of the states themselves? Like, the thing that I think is hard sometimes when we're talking about cannabis at large is you're talking about a space and industry that is populated by a litany of different constituencies, political leanings, religious observance. You're talking about a lot of conflicting signals in terms of who these consumers are, and more importantly, who the participating companies are. Do you think a lot of markets and their potential for success is sort of predicated off the pre-existing culture in the market?
Totally. I think the pre-existing culture matters, which is why an existing kind of like gray market is very challenging to deal with. And so you can say that California and Michigan have had a harder job than other states that have not tolerated, right, an illicit or gray market for a long time. So, I mean, to your point, absolutely, the existing culture matters. But with that being said, I think here you have two states that have made radically different policy choices, and we can see the results of those different policy choices. And so it's telling that, again, not to say the Michigan market's perfect, there's plenty of distress there, but the market continues to grow because taxes are fairly low and because they don't make it incredibly difficult to open a new store. It doesn't take 5 years in Michigan.
You must be frustrated considering how simple it seems on the face of it, but how hard it is for these markets to institute obvious change like that.
Yeah, I mean, it really is frustrating. You see cities in California, even those that have passed retail ordinances, they continue to pass ordinances that are so bureaucratic that in practice it takes several years to open. And so I think one of our jobs in California is to circulate those policy ideas that are and aren't working, because again, there are probably 50 or 60 cities that have passed ordinances, say during COVID or afterwards, and yet have only a fraction of the licensed stores online. So there's definitely a significant opportunity for improvement at the local level in California.
Do you think, and this is a loaded question, how does cannabis as a space which has such a strong contribution to the macro climate from an economic standpoint? I think as of today there was an article that came out that said contributions from a state taxation standpoint is about 5.6 to 5.8 billion that we've contributed to state coffers. Yet, we don't really have that much political clout up on the Hill. In your opinion, and this is a loaded question, what are some of the levers of potential power influence that we can have to actually start instituting change effectively on the Hill from a federal and from a state standpoint? What are the preceding changes we can make, or how do we do that as a market that doesn't currently have political clout?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really good and sort of like complex question there. I would say, like, why does cannabis not have clout? One, obviously, it's the enduring stigma against cannabis. People are kind of blind to the economic impact that cannabis has because they're willingly blind to it, right? Because they consider cannabis to be a drug. So that is part of it. I think part of it also is just the dysfunctional nature of our federal government, right? When we say cannabis doesn't have clout, I mean, what we're saying is that it's really difficult to get 60 votes in the US Senate for a cannabis reform bill, right? We've had bills pass the House many times, and it's really difficult to get 60 votes on the Senate in anything. And so part of the reason cannabis doesn't have clout is we're kind of stuck in the closet here and we can't get out, right, because of political dysfunction. But to answer your question, like, how does cannabis get more clout? I think there are two ways. One is the jobs number, right? So you cited the tax revenue number, which is an important one. But really the most compelling and intuitively understandable thing about cannabis's economic impact is the jobs number. You can say, hey, there are 50,000 people that work in the coal mining industry. There are 400,000 people that work in the cannabis industry. And things like that can give you a sense of perspective. And so I think that needs to be part of the public narrative more and more going forward. I mean, and just to drill down on that, there are some states, if I take Montana for example, where almost 1% of their workforce works in cannabis. I mean, that's kind of remarkable if you think about it. States like New Mexico and Montana, I mean, 1% of their working age population, not their entire population, right? There are 4,000, 5,000 people in these small states who work in cannabis. So I think that's part of it, which is just the economic impact as measured by jobs, and we can see how that has political currency. But I think the second thing, and maybe we'll get to this later with other states, I think we need to have more red states come online, more big red states come online, because in an increasingly polarized country, this is seen as an issue of maybe one party, and it's no secret that before Missouri came online this year, I mean, all of the legal states were on the coasts, besides like Colorado and Illinois. And so that's the other thing, getting more red states to come online is key.
This is actually a good segue into the idea of the Deep South. I mean, so one of the things that's very interesting about cannabis, I think we started around the same time. You preceded me by a couple of years, I actually think. But cannabis, in large part in most people's minds, and kind of on the map, not as of late, it's changing more and more, really is a coastal enclave play. And specifically, as of late, there has been not just a change, but a wholesale change in terms of not just allowing and making cannabis more permissible in these states, but actually seeing markets surprisingly spring up and be functioning in a way that's surprising, considering that if you're talking about it from a political side, you think that the affiliations from cannabis would not necessarily be rooted in what typically is considered conservative states. Mm-hmm. So that being the case, as of late, Georgia, Mississippi, very surprising and two specific models that have been produced that we haven't seen before. Do you want to give some color?
Yeah, I think Georgia and Mississippi are super interesting examples. And I mean, just to your larger point about the Deep South and about conservative America, you're right? It's traditionally not been seen as a conservative issue. But if you strip away all the cultural baggage, it should be a conservative issue,
correct,
right? Should the government be able to criminalize a plant? If you're truly conservative, you would laugh at that idea. What is the best example of the biggest failed government program in American history? It's the criminal justice system. I mean, it's hard to think of a program we spend more money on that does not create an ROI. So, I mean, to your point, this should be seen as conservative values, right? Regardless of your politics. But on Georgia and Mississippi, I mean, why are these two states so exciting? Let's take Georgia, for example. Georgia recently announced that you can buy, Georgia has a medical program. It's nascent in many ways. They only allow, kind of low THC oils, so they don't even allow flower. So it is a modest program. But Georgia recently announced that those, low THC oil products will be available in independent pharmacies in the state. And to really drill down, there are about 500 to 600 pharmacies in Georgia. 120 of them have already signed up to carry these products. Mm-hmm. That's a lot. And if you look at a map of where these are, 90% of Georgia's population will be within a 30-minute drive of one of these pharmacies. Now, we shouldn't pretend this will be a full-scale, cannabis access.
Sure.
But contrast that to California, where I can drive for hours in this state, right, and not be able to legally purchase cannabis. You won't be able to say that in Georgia, right? You'll be able to do so. So I think it's interesting. It further illustrates the idea of cannabis as medicine, right? When we are saying that independent pharmacies can carry this product, right, and we're incorporating it into our pharmacy system, we are reaffirming that principle. So that's incredibly exciting. And in Mississippi, I think something a little different but equally exciting is going on there. So Mississippi, passed a medical cannabis program just a couple of years ago, so relatively recently. It just got offline, this year. It's been the fastest growing medical program in history, which I think is notable. As of today, early October, there are 30,000 people registered in Mississippi's program, which is 1% of the population. That's the fastest that's ever been reached. I mean, just as a contrast, Georgia, which passed a law many years mm-hmm. ago, is still at half that number. So we're seeing a ton of people registered. We have more than 100 dispensaries open in the state. And so Mississippi has taken a very permissive approach towards cannabis, sort of the opposite approach that neighboring Alabama has. Alabama and some other states have had a very limited license system. Mississippi has had a much more open system. So it's exciting to see that economy develop and patients register. But really, I think the most exciting thing, or the thing that really caught my attention, is recently they passed a law in Mississippi that says that you can access, without a medical card, topical cannabis products. So, I mean, again, what that means is it's a medical program, but I, as a 21-year-old, right, even if I don't have a medical card, I can go in and buy a topical, like a lotion product, which may not seem like a big deal, but this is the first time you, as an adult, can buy an adult use cannabis program product in the South. And so, again, I think it further just breaks down those walls between cannabis and medicine. And it seems so intuitive and so logical, but it's a pretty big deal in Mississippi that, that's a felony if you go across the line, across the Mississippi Delta,
right,
and you're in another state, right? So,
well, I think it's interesting too when you think about, well, at the larger context, like you and I technically are aiding and abetting because we're still very much in a marketplace and an industry that's fairly prohibited. But those are active programs, those are active pursuits. Let's talk about the potential new. So November, Ohio is on the ballot. They say that they have the votes. They feel very strongly about it. They've returned several times with signatures. What makes you excited for this state to be the 24th and a potential catalyst? Like, what leads you to believe that this could be an important demarcation point?
Yeah. I think Ohio is the most exciting thing going on in U.S. cannabis right now. I really believe that.
At large?
Writ large. I mean,
Wow.
to me at least. I think about it a lot, and I'll kind of tell you why. I think it's very, very exciting. So as you mentioned, Ohio will be on the ballot this November. So November 7th, Ohio will be voting on adult use cannabis legalization. October 11th is actually the first day of early voting. So if there's anyone from Ohio who's watching this, you can vote starting on October 11th, and you should go out and vote. And so why is Ohio so exciting? I mean, there's a ton of reasons. First, it would be the 24th state to legalize cannabis. And just in the American imagination, getting to half the states, I think, is consequential just in terms of public narrative. And I can't tell you how many times in the past 6 months I've read an article that said almost half the states have legalized cannabis. And that's a big difference from where we were a year ago when we were at like 17 or 18.
Right, the proverbial tipping point.
The proverbial tipping point, right? And I do think that has symbolic power. And in a context where federal prohibition doesn't make sense, it further illustrates how it doesn't make sense, right? Like half the states have legalized this. So that's part of the reason, 24. The second is, I think it'll really have the country's attention. And what I mean by that is, there are two issues that Ohio will vote on this November. So one is cannabis legalization, and one is abortion rights, which we know has been a hot button issue since the Dobbs decision, overturning Roe v. Wade came down last year. And not to venture too far afield into politics or those political issues, but those are issues which generate turnout, right? Especially abortion rights. And Ohio is very interesting because it's a big red state. And again, without getting into politics, what we see in many red states is that they're heavily gerrymandered, which is to say the state legislature this is just objectively true, in Ohio and in Florida and in Pennsylvania are much more conservative than their citizens. And so these state legislatures, refuse to legalize cannabis, right? Refuse to legalize abortion, or at least opposed to it. And so I think Ohio is the perfect policy experiment where I predict, and let's come back in a month or so and see whether I'm right or wrong, but I predict that on these two issues, which are abortion rights and cannabis legalization, Ohio will treat these as freedom issues, regardless of their politics. So I think you'll see a circumstance where, again, I'm kind of hesitant to make predictions, but I'm going to. I think you're going to see at least 57, 58% of people vote for cannabis legalization in Ohio. And I mention all this because that's the kind of thing that gets national attention, that illustrates the discrepancy between how voters feel and how elected officials feel. So I point that out to say, this will be big because it's the 24th, but I also think it'll capture sort of the national attention. A few more reasons I think it'll be a big deal. First, Ohio is a really big state, right? It's 12 million people.
Yeah.
And so once Ohio legalizes, 55% of Americans will live in an adult use state. I mean, just going back to what we were saying before, more than half. So that's a bunch of people coming on.
From a population perspective.
From a population perspective, exactly. And look, you can kind of tease that out and say, yeah, but there's some people in California who don't have access to, but 55% of Americans will live in a state that has a law on the books saying, hey, we have legal cannabis, so that's powerful. And then, it also borders a number of prohibition states.
Right.
And so in the same way that a year ago, you and I could have been talking let's say this was a year ago, and we were talking about the Missouri ballot initiative, we'd be saying, oh shoot, like Missouri's, they could legalize. And if they legalize, they border 7 prohibition states. And Kansas City is right on the border of Kansas. I bet that'll be a really robust market. Similarly, like Cincinnati is right on the Kentucky border. And I mean, the population center of Kentucky, Louisville, right, Lexington, that's right outside Cincinnati. Or Pittsburgh, right in Pennsylvania, is right near Ohio. So you will see a huge influx of traffic from Indiana, from Kentucky, right, from West Virginia, from Pennsylvania, and a number of states. And so it'll make for a robust economy. A couple more things I'll say, because I think there are a ton of reasons to be excited about this. So not only will that make that market successful, but that will also put pressure on neighboring states, right? So Pennsylvania, if Ohio legalizes, will be surrounded by 5 adult use states. And what we have seen is that when you're surrounded, you kind of give up, right? New Hampshire was not going to legalize cannabis for a long time, but now they're surrounded on all sides. And lo and behold, the Republican governor's like, okay, we'll legalize cannabis. So it's exciting because it will accelerate other states coming online. Pennsylvania, a huge state, being the best example. And then, again, not to get too far into the weeds, but in addition, there will be 3 states in the Midwest who then border 3 adult use states, right? So like Kentucky and Indiana, right? They will border 3 adult use states. So that part of it is exciting. And then maybe 1 or 2 more things I'll say, because I could go on for a while. So again, super healthy market. When a market is healthy, that tends to generate local support, right? So the reason why Josh Hawley, the senator from Missouri, who as of a year ago hated cannabis but has since been silent on the subject, is that it's a huge economic driver in his state, right?
Massive, yeah.
And I think you could see the same thing from someone like J.D. Vance, right, a senator from Ohio, who is known to kind of participate in the culture wars, and you could very easily hear him saying, don't California my Ohio,
Sure.
which is the common refrain. But I don't think that'll happen. And finally, Sherrod Brown, the head of the Senate Banking Committee, is also from Ohio. So I think there are a ton of reasons why this will generate attention, expand access, and back to our earlier point, will change dynamics in D.C.
Yeah. Do you think, so in a sense, every time we talk about a market that has, not the market itself or the state itself, but the surrounding marketplace, what we're talking about is proliferation, right? Of use, of thoughts, of experience, of communal impact, of job creation, et cetera, et cetera. In a sense, it becomes an easier issue across the aisle from the political spectrum, specifically because these are people in your backyard or down the street from you. So proximity breeds familiarity, which basically breeds acceptance. And what you're really kind of, to put a pin in it, and no disrespect, Ohio is one of those things that leads to a larger conversation in states that would never have even fathomed the idea of making it permissive, and now that might be the changing point. I think that's a very powerful thing. And you're right, when we think about these markets and the birth of one, we sometimes singularly think about it being only an Ohio prospect, as if the surrounding states won't find and be affected by it, for better and sometimes for worse. Occasionally there's issues because of that. But I think what we're talking about is just another instance of mass proliferation. And thankfully, as we get this longer historical arc of development, and as an industry and as people within it, the information exchange is really important. The educational piece is really important. I've noticed that you've actually had a lot of conversations at major universities. I think you were actually at the University of Virginia.
Yeah, I got to teach a class there recently, which was cool.
Yeah. And so, in your experience, and that's Virginia, perfect example. You're going into these markets and you're educating people about your experience, your expertise, your mindset, your skills, and you're also talking about the maturation of these potential places. When you come across students, is it a typical is there a bias and selective process where these students are, kind of what you would expect? Or are you seeing more of the generation coming up in academia from all across the aisle, whether their political affiliations or not? Are you seeing more of a wider acceptance and interest from the student body?
Totally. Yeah. I was so blown away by these students I met at UVA. So I got the chance to teach a class at UVA Law School. They're teaching a cannabis policy course for the first time, and they were nice enough to invite me to give a lecture there. And obviously it's a self-selecting group, right? You're teaching a cannabis policy class, so you're going to get people who are interested in the subject. But I was overwhelmed by their level of interest, just their level of knowledge. They were following policy experiments more than people in the industry were, because those people are so busy building their businesses. And so I guess this should have been expected. This is a slightly younger generation, and we know that Gen Z, for example, is much more favorable towards cannabis than alcohol. So maybe I shouldn't have been surprised. But I was just blown away by just their level of engagement, their level of questions. These folks in Virginia, as people know well, Virginia has legalized cannabis, but has not developed a regulatory framework. So these people are, these students are all passionate about playing a role in developing what that framework was. So it was amazing to get to have a dialogue with them, thinking that, hey, maybe one of them will somehow be involved in developing this framework. So yeah, all I can say is I was really blown away by them. And as someone who was in law school not that long ago, 15 years ago, when I was in law school and I was very interested in drug policy, I had to kind of keep it quiet, and I had to sort of figure out how to develop my own curriculum, And this was just a marked difference in cultural attitudes, and so it was just so refreshing. And there's so much legal talent that is going into what I consider less interesting careers, and I would love to funnel some of that talent, I think, to the drug policy movement.
We'd love to speak to them.
Yeah.
That's the interesting thing. Maybe there's a melding here. Maybe we can actually, have a conversation with the students, because what I'd love to find more than anything else, and we talked about this prior, which is I'd like to find, the anticipation that cannabis brings in a lot of these markets, and most importantly, in student bodies, in different communal groups and different communities. I think it's important to speak loudly as much as we can about access to more education as much as possible, to mentorship opportunities. There's a lot of expertise in cannabis that are willing to teach and speak to what it's like to work within a space that's very opaque if you're not inside of it. And the other thing I'm kind of curious about too is, if you had to, for like a kind of our last question here, what are some of the things that active leadership in cannabis can do to teach the generation coming up How can the generation coming up listen and learn from the generation already in cannabis? Your thoughts?
Yeah, I guess my simple answer is just going to be education. I don't know. I mean, I think the important things are education and cultural familiarity, right? And so what I mean by that is we should all educate ourselves on the tremendous power of the cannabis plant. I grew up in a culture in which cannabis was understood to be medicine, and I think that is a truth that human beings have long recognized, and now we're getting to the point where our modern sort of scientific understanding can confirm that. So I don't know, I think that's a critical part of education, which is just the amazing potential of plant medicine, which many of us have experienced in our own lives. So I think that's part of it. And then another part of it is just recognizing just the cultural significance of this movement, right? Some people describe cannabis as no different than other industries. This is just CPG, we're just selling widgets. And I understand those analogs, but there's obviously a deep spiritual and medicinal power to this commodity. And I think that has to be properly respected by anyone who's engaging with it if you really want to be successful. So
it's interesting because I think you bring up a good point, which is people outside the scope of the cannabis industry kind of talk about cannabis as always being part of the national dialogue versus what we know to be true, which is it's actually part of the national fabric. I mean, we have been singing songs about this for quite some time. I mean, we enjoy this plant to its fullest, and to your point, it's been a part of communal empowerment and ceremony and reflection for a long time. Now we're starting to get acceptance in a place where it's been viciously prohibited for quite some time. I think the thing that might take some time, well, I don't think it's going to take as much time as we think, but to reduce the stigma is all about exposure. And going back to the conversation we just had, Ohio and the potential change there, further proliferation in these markets, it's hard not to feel like the prospect in the future of cannabis is actually kind of certain. I think the biggest issue we have right now is how early are we, not if we're correct.
Yeah.
That being the case, if people out there in TV land have questions, concerns, insights, any prospective people that would love to talk to you and learn more about what you do and how you are, how can they get in contact with you?
Yeah, I'm on social media. So if you're on Twitter or X, my handle is Ananda Strategy. That's ANANDA. I post my thoughts on a lot of state markets there, and I also do that on Instagram as well. So that's where you can follow me. And if you want to email me, you can just send me an email at Hirsh, that's HIRSH, at anandastrategy.com.
Thanks for coming by. This was a fun conversation. This was fun. This was a serious geek out session. We could talk for hours more, but we're going to have to cut off there. If you want a part 2, email us, because this is fun. He doesn't live far. Again, I'm Mike Seibold over at FlowerHire. If you need anything from a talent perspective, please give us a jingle. Take care.
Cool.
This was fun. It's my bad. All the way into the end, too.